Welcome to The Human Side of Money, a show dedicated to equipping financial advisors with the skill set required to work with emotional human beings on the emotionally charged topic of money. You'll get practical tips and insights on applying behavioral finance into your practice from conversations with fellow advisors, industry consultants, and experts in the fields of behavior, psychology, communication, and more. Each episode is designed to help you enhance client outcomes and forever change the trajectory of your advisory business. Now here's your host, Brendan Frazier.
Michael Finke, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Brendan.
So I have to say, you've validated me in a way that very few people have in my life. I think that's the best way to start this conversation. And so for the longest time, I've always wondered, why do so many of my analogies, examples, and metaphors when it comes to finance always tie back to eating or exercise or health? And then I start getting made fun of for it because, like, Brendan, do you have anything else you can relate this to other than eating, exercise, and health? And then I hear a story that you told that it was actually the link between the two that got you into doing this, the research that you do in the first place, to become a nationally renowned researcher on retirement. So maybe let's start there so everybody else can hear that I'm not crazy and that it actually makes sense to be able to connect money food and wealth. And that actually just happens to be part of your journey as to how you got to where you are today. Can you share that with us?
It is, Brendan. So it's been a circuitous route to where my career is right now in financial planning. I started out as a food consumption researcher. I studied what motivated people to eat healthy food. So my dissertation was on who read nutrition labels and whether or not that actually affected what you ate. I had this theory that what motivated people to eat healthy foods was that they valued the future. So some people just have this natural tendency to live for the future, to be more willing to subvert your happiness today in order to increase your happiness in the future. There's this, very famous Walter Mischel marshmallow test where it appears that people actually get programmed relatively early on in life about the extent to which they have what's known as a low rate of time preference. So what that means is that we have, over the course of our lifetime, the ability to imagine how happy we could be. And we apply a rate of discounting to the future. So, I care about how happy I'm going to be when I'm 70, but I don't care quite as much as the amount of happiness I get today. So I'm going to discount that a little bit. And some people discount it more. Some people just don't care. And they apply a high rate of discounting. An economist can actually come up with a number, and they can do little experiments. They can say, would you prefer X amount of money right now or X amount of money in the future? So that was my theory about what motivated people to eat healthy foods and exercise. And there were a lot of really interesting policy implications because that means that some people are just wired for it. That means that other people just don't care. Some people do care a lot about the future. That's going to show up in a range of different behaviors. And one of those behaviors that I was noticing is that there is this strong correlation between healthy eating and accumulating wealth. So the same people who tend to eat healthy diets are also the same people that tend to save more money. I had this great data set called the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. It started out when they were teenagers, measured things like time preference when they were teenagers. And I could follow the same people all the way into their 40s and 50s, and I could see how some of those preferences when they were younger impacted their savings and their BMI and their health. You can actually measure all these things later on in life. But I noticed that there is this strong correlation, and I really wanted to understand finance theory. I wanted to understand, according to investments theory, what motivated people to invest and take risk and save for the future. So I just out of the blue decided to take a PhD course in investments. And I was at University of Missouri at the time. I was an assistant professor studying food consumption, and I just took this class, and I loved it. It was just, to me, and this is one of the things I think a lot of people don't recognize about finance, is that finance is not a quantitative field. Finance is a social science. It is the science of understanding what motivates people to take risk How much do you have to compensate them for taking risk? What does risk mean in terms of lifestyle, in terms of consumption? It's all based on, it's all human beings deciding that they're going to take some of their savings and maybe take some risk with it. And then in the future, they're going to spend that money. And we know a lot about what people prefer based on the choices that they make. So it's a social science. It's understanding human beings. To me, that was what was so fascinating about finance, is that you could get insight into human motivations that you couldn't get in other fields, because finance is genuine. People make decisions with their money that truly reflect their values. And you can understand a lot about human motivation by understanding what they do with their money. And so I took this class that was somewhat quantitative, but I'd been trained as an economist, so I could handle the quantitative stuff. And at the end of the course, the professor took me aside and said, Michael, do you know how much more money you could make if you were a finance professor than if you were a food consumption professor? So I ended up getting my PhD in finance at that time because basically I was bribed into it. But I really was fascinated by the whole topic. That investments is a social science, corporate finance is a social science. It is to me, it remains one of my favorite topics. I love reading books on the history of finance theory. I'm just kind of a geek that way, but that is the thing that ties it all together, though, is that in finance, I am motivated to save for the future if I imagine that I'm going to be happier when I spend the money, and if I value that. So I need to value spending in the future, and I also need to believe that the money is going to make me happier in order to motivate me to save. Now, when it comes to investing, taking investment risk, it means I'm willingness to accept a certain amount of volatility in the amount that I'm going to be able to spend in the future. Some people are more willing to accept greater variation, greater uncertainty. Some people are not. And that really defines your preference for taking investment risk. And again, it all comes down to the brain. The brain is what sets asset prices.
Yeah, well, you're on the right podcast to have that belief. In fact, that's probably part of the reason why we have you on here, because at the end of the day, it is more about what goes on inside your mind than what you see on a spreadsheet. Anyway, so that's something that we agree wholeheartedly on. The question that I keep coming back to is, back to the food thing for a second. You were looking at what motivates people to eat healthy, and if it had to do with how much they valued the future, was that one of the predictors of whether somebody would eat healthy was how much they valued their future, just like it is with money?
Yeah, so I was actually able to take a group of behaviors when they were younger and combine them together into a single factor, which represented how much you value the future. And that single factor predicted how much wealth you accumulated later on in life, more than IQ, more than any other trait like education, things like that. It was shocking how much that willingness to value the future, to defer gratification, actually impacted people's decisions. And I think you can see that when you talk to financial planning clients. I think there, in many ways, are two types of clients. One, let's call them the ants. The ants are always saving for the future. They're motivated by a habit of thrift. And there's also the grasshoppers. And maybe the grasshopper came to see you because they inherited some money from their parents. Maybe they sold a business. But grasshoppers don't have that same low rate of future discounting. And what it means is that they're far more vulnerable to spending money when they get liquid cash. But it also, there's a whole conversation we can have about people who tend to live like grasshoppers and people who tend to live like ants, because they're absolutely fascinating. In the research that I've done, the conclusion I've come to is that most of us are ants. I mean, if we're in this field, we're ants. And that means we have this tendency to overaccumulate. And we don't get as much out of life because we tend to overaccumulate. We tend to believe that it's somehow morally a good thing if we have more money, if we save more. But the reality is that money is not what makes you happy. And in fact, that to me is one of these great truths. It's an input. It's numbers on a computer screen. It's green paper. But money in and of itself is just a component of happiness, and you need to combine it with other things to actually make you better off.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sitting here thinking about it as you said it. It feels like saving money. Well, I don't know whether this is just something that inherently happens to us or if we're receiving messages from somewhere, but saving money feels like a badge of honor, but spending money feels sort of like a scarlet letter, right? Where it's like you're proud to say you save and it feels good, but there's almost something that feels, and I'm not saying it should be this way, but it almost feels like, is it okay to spend? Am I supposed to spend? There's not a whole lot of praise to go around for spending, but if you can save, like you're doing something right.
You are. I mean, and selfishly, a financial advisor has no incentive to encourage their client not to believe that saving is a good thing.
Right.
But
with an AUM model, right? Where you're getting paid more, but more assets you have. Right. Yeah, no doubt. That's right.
But the reality is that what is the money there for? I am a big believer in having an honest conversation about what they want to do, what a client wants to do with their money, and especially in retirement. I think we forget the fact that there's only two places our money can go. Our money can either go to lifestyle, can help us live better, or the money can go to someone else after we're gone. And there's no third option. So being deliberate to me is, I think you're right. I think that we have this habit of thrift, this Protestant ethic thing. It's kind of ingrained in us. My dad was German, so I had this idea that you're always supposed to be thinking of the future. You're always supposed to be imagining the worst possible thing that could happen and protecting yourself against that. People who don't do that are morally wrong. They deserve bad things when they happen to them. And that can cause you to make life choices that mean that you don't get as much out of this too brief experience on Earth. And philosophically, I think there's more that we can do in this profession to remind people of the purpose of money.
So, Hal Hirschfield, he's the future self guy, wrote the book, The Future Self, had him on the podcast. And on the podcast, even in a lot of the work that he's done, even he says that he's a big believer in not just focusing on the future, but you've got to find a way to maintain and balance it and also prioritize the present. Right? And so to me, it's like, hey, if the future self guy says that we need to prioritize the present self and be able to spend, all right, learn how to use our money and not just save for the future, then that's good enough for me as an excuse to do it. You said one thing a second ago that I thought was really insightful and wanted to ask you a follow-up question on it. You said that money is an insight into human motivation, where you can kind of see how people spend, what their motivation is. Can you think of anything else that does the same thing? Is there anything else that will give us a lens into what motivates people?
Oh gosh. I love money because it's quantifiable and it's genuine. So, I can see what people are spending their money on. It's so fascinating to look at things like life satisfaction and to look at how people spend their money and the impact it has on life satisfaction. So time use is another way to do this. So we can look at what people value based on how they spend their day. And there is this intersection between time use and money spending that is so important at predicting happiness, and that is that the amount of money we spend, the amount of time we spend and money with other human beings tends to be a consistent predictor of life satisfaction. So in other words, if one of the smartest things that we can do is go out to dinner with a friend. A lot of personal finance gurus say, well, it's just waste to go to Starbucks and have a cup of coffee with a friend or to go out to dinner. But you get more happiness per dollar from that activity than you do just about anything else. So remembering that we need to be careful about how we spend the money and how we spend our time is an important part of getting the most out of it. What's the use of getting more money if we're not applying the same level of discipline to what we spend the money on. Because it does seem like there's a lot of stuff that people spend money on that really doesn't make them any happier. And there's a lot of things that you could be spending money on that could make you a lot happier, but you're just not aware of it. And is it the financial advisor's job to, suggest when they see a client maybe spending money on the wrong things that maybe they consider, taking their family on a European vacation or something like that? That could make them happier than buying the new car or the vacation house or something that is probably not going to make them as happy.
Yeah, and so I think about this a lot, and the problem that always pops up in my mind is being able to do that from the advisor perspective and encourage happier spending. First of all, requires an understanding of what spending leads to higher levels of happiness and satisfaction, right? And I think that's maybe the underlying problem is we don't necessarily know really. Some things I think you intuitively know. By and large, I don't think most of us would know, like, hey, this is something that I know that I can say empirically, or it's research backed, that this spending on this leads to a higher level of happiness and satisfaction. So maybe that's the question, which is, what are the things to think about, or where are the areas of spending that do lead to more happiness?
Well, social spending is it. I mean, if you look at the different categories, any spending category that increases the likelihood of interaction with other human beings is going to make you happier. Now, that could include things like, if you're a guy in retirement, spending money on a classic car. This is a great example I've heard you mention before. I was hoping you were going to bring it up because it feels contradictory to what we know as far as like material goods and experiences, things and experiences. You're like, wait a minute, isn't buying a car just like a material good that you could easily say, oh, that doesn't bring you happiness? But you have evidence, you have research that backs up that it might actually be. Yeah, the spending money on the car thing is not quite statistically significant, but very close. And my hunch is that people who do spend money on something like a classic car in retirement, what it's giving them is entree into a community. It's giving them a bit of a sense of her purpose, a new set of friends and acquaintances, people to communicate with online. My uncle a few years ago bought a classic car. Actually, did a partnership with him. He always wanted the car, so we bought it together. The deal was that when he wasn't able to drive it anymore, I'd keep it. But what it got him was an introduction to the local mechanic and a whole community of people online, and he could go to car shows and show up in his car and people would ask about it. It was a whole new aspect of his life that he didn't have before that provided a lot of joy. And how much joy did he actually get out of driving the car? Not a huge amount. But what it got him was something to do that was social. And I think for men, especially in retirement, because men don't do as good of a job as women of maintaining friendships, and that's a whole other conversation about what it is that leads to satisfaction in retirement. It's essentially health and human connection and money. And they all go together. Men do, I think, a very poor job of recognizing the importance of investing in those social connections during their working years that they can then draw from in retirement.
I want to ask real quick. I actually want to get back to what you said, those three things you said that lead to a more satisfying retirement. I want to come back to that. But I'm curious, you said as far as spending for happiness, it all boils down to social spending. What about somebody that would say, well, I've heard that if you spend money on experiences, that's a good way to do it. Or I spend money to buy back time. Are those things are they still relevant? Is it still true that that's a good way to spend money? They're just not as impactful. Would you say that they're not as helpful as they're touted to be?
No, I'd say it's all part of the same equation. So, paying someone to clean your house or to mow your lawn, that means that you have more time available for things that actually provide you with more joy. Now, it's up to you to actually do something.
That's right.
And watch TV. And by the way, that is the number one time use activity in retirement, other than sleeping, is watching television.
Yeah.
And we can get into a deeper conversation about why that is. In many cases, we are social beings, and we are rewarded internally for interacting with other social human beings. Television is just a substitute for that. It's it's a way, in a way, it's not giving us the same level of fulfillment as actually doing it, but it is our bodies, essentially our minds, craving that opportunity to interact with other human beings, and the reward that we get. Our bodies essentially reward us with chemicals for social interaction, and television is a substitute for that. But we've got to be very careful about, if we're buying time, using it wisely.
Yeah, that's funny. I say that all the time too. It's like, you can buy back your time, and that's good. But what are you actually going to do with the time is what actually makes a difference. So next time you have somebody come mow your lawn, make sure while they're mowing your lawn, you're hanging out with other people, doing something social or something meaningful. Otherwise, I mean, maybe this is a little bit extreme, but maybe a way to motivate yourself to do it is be like, next time I look outside and I see the guy mowing our lawn, if I'm inside scrolling my phone or watching something on Netflix, I'm going to be like, this was a waste of money. This was a waste of money. I could probably be doing
outside getting some exercise,
with a friend outside, getting some exercise with a friend. Have you, knowing to use money for social spending, or to well, you just said men aren't as good at this as maintaining friendships over time. So knowing this, have you done anything in particular? Have you spent your money in any type of way that's helped improve your social life?
Yes. So one of the things that I'm very careful to do is invest in maintaining friendships. So what that means is taking the time, flying places to see friends, to maintain those connections. I'll give you an example with my uncle. So my dad passed away when he was relatively young. At some point, I decided that every year my uncle and I were going to, he lived in Phoenix at the time, we were going to go to those European car auctions in Scottsdale. So, every year I would fly up, we would spend a week together, we'd go to the car auctions, we'd build a more lasting relationship than we had before then. Now he texts me all the time and we're close friends, but we weren't at the time. It was an investment that I made consciously in having a closer connection with a family member who I enjoyed being around. So that's an example of me having the discipline to be able to make an investment in a relationship that I could then draw from later.
Yeah, that's a great example. In fact, it has me thinking through too. I feel like I need to do a social audit of my life and be like, okay, who are the people? Because the other thing too, I think, is trying to figure out, you only have so much time, right? So we've got little kids. It's like, we can't just go do anything and everything. I think I mentioned a couple episodes ago, like at this point in our lives, like we don't even really have time to hang out with acquaintances. It's sort of like, who are the people that are going to be in our lives for a long time? But it just, even hearing this has motivated me to go, all right, how do I want to make sure that I'm continuing to build and maintain the relationships that I've had. And when I hear your example of going to see your uncle, I can't, from the money side, from the finance side, I come back to the fact that you had to fly there in order to do that for a week, right? So even then, that's how you spent the money to improve or invest in the relationship, right? Like these things come with a price tag. And so if you have a client, if you can help them direct that money to do things like that, then that's a pretty meaningful thing. The question what I keep coming back to is, when you think about advisors and the work that they do with their clients, do you think, let's say in your mind, when you picture this, do you envision advisors doing some education with their clients around the benefits of human connection and starting there, and then having conversations around who is it that you want to spend more time with? Let's do that. Is it that explicit? How do you see that happening in the relationship with a client?
Oh, Brendan, this is such a long conversation to have about what is the role of a financial advisor, especially today. I listened to your podcast and got this nugget that I thought was so valuable, which is, when you're listening to someone talk about their life, you roll it through your head and then you repeat what they just told you to them, so that it shows them that you're not only listening, but you're understanding what they're saying. And that there is this whole conversation about today, what are the most important skills? What service is the advisor actually providing? And there is this philosophy. I was recently at a conference in England that was just focused on talking about life planning. And, some of the advisors there don't bring up money until the second meeting, maybe the third meeting. The first meeting is just a life inventory. What do you want to achieve? And, what is your current circumstance? And inventorying things like friendships and understanding what you could be spending the money on could be part of that inventory. One of the things I was thinking is, like, in the future, advisors are using model portfolios. No parent company wants you to pick investments. And that's not how you provide value anyway. And things like tax planning are going to become increasingly automated. Software is going to do that for you. Obviously, I don't want to be the AI guy, but it seems increasingly that aspect of financial planning is becoming automated. And then the question becomes, what is your role? And then what kind of skill set do you need to do your job effectively? And then what is your, what are the kind of conversations that you should be having with a client? And I do think that in the future, we're probably going to need to spend more time developing those skills that can help the client draw out what they hope to actually achieve with their life plan, with their money. So, we're not psychologists, but we do need to drill down into people's motivations, and we need to understand their life. It's not just about, hey, we're going to put your money in this portfolio and, this is how much money you're going to save and you're going to be fine in the future. If I go to a doctor, I would want my doctor to ask me, what are your health goals? Do you feel like you want to get in better shape? Is your weight where you want it to be? Tell me a little bit about your family history. How did your parents treat their health? How well did they live in old age? What kind of health were they in when they were in their 80s? That kind of a conversation from a professional seems much more useful to me than the kind of conversations that I very often have with my doctor right now, which are very much focused on the present. That's right. And if you had that kind of context, could my doctor make suggestions that were a lot more helpful to me about meeting my long-term goals if they understood me better? I feel like that's something that we should be doing better in financial planning, is having these kind of, first of all, we need to have a different skill set. And things like repeating what the client said to you, that's a skill that I think, and if you look at the data, you see that especially younger generations tend to score lower on empathy tests, which means that you really have to train them to be effective at empathy and having these kind of personal conversations with a client. So should we be training people different in this field, especially if a lot of the other stuff that we're actually training them to do is going to be automated? Yeah.
I mean, I bet you know my answer to that question, or my thoughts to the answer on that question. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's at the end of the day, you don't have to be the AI guy, right? But I think most people would say the writing's on the wall that a lot of the technical knowledge is becoming more and more commoditized. Who knows when that's going to happen? Who knows when it's fully that way? But but I guess what I always say, the way I always think about it is, you don't ever meet somebody, or I shouldn't say you don't ever, you'll very rarely meet somebody in this industry, in this profession, that's like, no, all you need is technical chops. And if you have technical chops, then you're good to go, right? Like that, like nobody denies that being able to like relate to and communicate with another human being and understand their motivations and desires is an important thing, right? And to your point, I think we can't just assume that because somebody comes in the office that they're gonna, like if I went to the doctor, like you said, and I would want them to ask me all of those questions for sure. I think it would be a better experience, feel more connected. I would like the doctor more. I'd be more willing to go. I think he could also do a better job diagnosing and prescribing. But if all it was just this cold, non-emotional, non-empathetic checklist of questions, it's not going to get the outcome that you're looking for. It's not going to create the conversation you're looking for, which comes back to having to train the skills to get people comfortable opening up and sharing these kinds of things with you, right? Like it's twofold. We want to know more than just the money, but we also need the skills to be able to draw that out of people in an effective way, which is why I know we're not therapists, but all you have to do is go and look at like, who are the people in this world that are really, really good at getting others to open up to them and trust them and share the most personal, intimate details of their life with them. And there's not many people that are better at it than a really good therapist.
I agree. You know, it's a whole different perspective on what is the role of a professional.
Yeah. And so, well, that's all, like you said, that's a whole nother conversation. Yeah. What I think I want to do, what we should do is focus on what you've mentioned. We've kind of teased it a little bit and danced around it, but I think this actually ties right into what we were talking about. Most people go, hey, I work with pre-retirees and retirees. I went and got trained and educated on I got my CFP, so I know how to do the technical side. I can do a financial plan. I can help evaluate their legacy needs, their estate planning needs, their insurance needs, their cash flow. We can do some tax planning. But at the end of the day, I also agree that it's not just about their money, but I want to help them like live a happy, more meaningful retirement. So the way I've heard it put from your side is, or the way you look at it is, there's 3 pillars for this retirement. And you mentioned it earlier, but I want to spend a little time on it. So sure. For anybody that's wondering, and I think the reason why I like it is it makes it feel so simple. It's just like, all right, these are the 3 pillars. So if you can, do you mind explaining what those are and how they contribute to a happy or a fulfilling, or how do you say it? Is it a satisfying retirement, a happy retirement, however you think of that?
Yeah, I think satisfying is probably the most accurate way to say it. So there's a great data set called the Health and Retirement Study. And they have a battery of questions on life satisfaction and retirement. You can combine them all together and you get this indicator of retirement satisfaction. And then you run what's known as a multivariate analysis and you see what are the things that predict life satisfaction. And when you do that, you end up with essentially 3 categories that tend to cluster together. One of them is any health-related questions. So this obviously health, and this is a great way to think about health. Health is an input into satisfaction in retirement, that you make an investment in your health so that you can live better in retirement. If you don't make an investment in your health, if you're not thinking about it in your 40s and 50s, I did a review for Advisor Perspectives on Peter Attia's Outlive book, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting about his perspective is that he focused on health as an investment. In other words, you make decisions in your life where you can either add to your health or you can just do nothing, and your health gradually gets worse over time. And it takes an effort to invest in that health. It takes time. You know, you've got to be deliberate about that process. There are things you can do that will increase the likelihood that you're going to be able to successfully invest in health, things like tracking your progress over time. But that's an input. And one of the most interesting insights is VO2 max, because it's measurable. So VO2 max is our body's ability to process oxygen. And if you look at what happens to VO2 max as you get older, it goes down. It goes down for people who are sedentary. It goes down for people who are moderately active. It goes down for people who are athletes. But people who are athletes start out at a higher level. And what that means is that when they get to retirement, they're still able to be active. Whereas someone who is sedentary, who hasn't made that investment, it's too late for them. It's like saving for retirement. You can't start saving for retirement in your mid-50s. You're not going to be successful. You can't start investing in your health effectively when you're 2 years away from retirement, because it's too late. You've already lost that ability to get the most out of your retirement activity. So imagine that, I want to go hiking in Switzerland in retirement. So I'm going to need money. So I got to fly there. I got to rent a chalet. But if I don't have,
hang on real quick. Have you been hiking in Switzerland before? Is this why you use that example? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. So you didn't wait till retirement. You're doing it now.
Well, that's another conversation. Let's pick up on that one after we talk about this.
All right.
If I don't have the VO2 max to go hiking on a mountain in Switzerland, it doesn't matter how much money I've got. I'm not going to be able to engage in that activity. And it's one of the reasons why I believe that, I mean, we all experience physical and cognitive decline when we're retirement age, in our 70s and 80s. We should enjoy ourselves more when we're younger. We should use the money as an input into enjoyment when we're in our late 60s and 70s, because the money is going to mean a lot less to us in our late 80s and 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm one of these fans of a spending path that starts out higher and actually ends up lower as we get older. It actually matches how people spend money, but especially if you look at the fun categories of spending, you see that spending really drops off a cliff when you're in your 80s. So you've got to enjoy it when you're younger. So health is an important input. Now, let's get back to your question about enjoying life when you're younger and more capable.
Right. You going to hike Switzerland now instead of waiting until you're not working anymore, not doing any more research and retired.
So I have a friend, Steve, who is not an economist. He teaches graphic design in Chicago. And we had this conversation about sabbaticals. So in academics, if you're at an institution long enough, eventually you get an opportunity to apply for a sabbatical. What does that mean? It means that you can focus on doing research for, you don't have to teach for either one semester and you get full salary, or you can take an entire school year off and get paid half as much. And so I got the sabbatical, took my one semester off, got paid full salary. And I was telling my friend Steve about this, and he was saying, Michael, you're an idiot. Like, why not take an entire 9-month, 2 semesters off? Then you got summers as bookends. So you got 15 months off, essentially. So you can take your retirement when you're in your 40s instead of when you're in your 70s. And I thought, God, that is a lot smarter than my decision. I think I actually understand economics better than I do. Like, I was so focused on not losing my income that I made the wrong decision. I just took one semester off. But if you have the opportunity to, I can work another half year when I'm, 67, 68. Not going to be a big difference. If I can bring my retirement up a little bit and enjoy myself more. And I do feel that this is a mistake that a lot of people make. They just, especially if you look at happiness of people in their late 40s, early 50s, this is when we are most productive. So, it's not an accident that we're unhappy in our late 40s and early 50s, because what we're doing is we're making sacrifices in order to make more money. So if we can talk about the whole cognitive science stuff, but essentially there's 2 types of intelligence. There's fluid intelligence and there's crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence tends to peak in your 20s. So, if you're a race car driver, then you're probably going to do your best in your mid-20s. Baseball player, your ability to respond immediately to a stimulus peaks in your mid-20s. So, like, Einstein had his magic year when he was 26. It just seems like this is where our brains are functioning the fastest. However, there is this knowledge component to making more effective choices. That's crystallized intelligence. And so we basically have a processor and we have a hard drive. Our hard drive builds up more information. And there is this period in our late 40s, early 50s where we have enough information in the hard drive, but our processor is still working pretty well. That's when we're most productive. So we will spend the most time working because we are rewarded the most for doing it. That makes perfect economic sense. However, you're giving up on enjoyment. So, this balance, like, you're sacrificing a lot during that period of your life. If you can grab a little bit more happiness, would it mean more to you over the course of your life than if you grabbed it when you were in your 70s? I think that's a difficult question. It's a trade-off that we all have to make, myself included, because, I'm an academic that does a lot of other stuff, and I make sacrifices to work more. I'll write another white paper, I'll give another presentation. But at some point, there has to be a balance. And I struggle with reaching that balance myself in my own life between, the joy and then the work that we get rewarded for.
Have you read Die with Zero?
I read a portion of it, and in general, I agree with that philosophy. I mean,
Yeah, you're not saying you agree with every single thing in there, but the reason I ask is because everything you've been talking about is sort of like echoing what's mentioned in that book. I mean, especially the idea. I think he calls it bucketing your time or time buckets, but basically like realizing that what you want to do. You may say that you want to go hike in Switzerland, right? And you say you want to do that, and you're like, I'll do that when I retire, when I'm 65 or 70. You may not be able to do that when you're 65 or 70. So the idea of saying, what is it that I want to do? And then taking that and putting it in the periods of your life when you're actually able to do it, right? Because so many of us think, oh, I'll get to it. And then it never actually comes around. So that was just one of the examples of one of the things you've been talking about. I've actually written it down 3 times, like, don't forget to ask, die with zero. Because I've heard so many things that have been echoed in there. You said that, and the other thing you said that I think is kind of a little bit humbling but important to note around health is it's unfortunate, but there's really no doing nothing and then just staying stagnant with your health. You're either declining or you're fighting the decline and like gradually improving, right? Like, you can't sit around and do nothing and just assume you're staying the same. Like, you're probably falling and declining, and you have to work against that, which I think is somewhat of a humbling reality, right? And you sit there and you're like, oh, I'm eating pretty well. I haven't worked out in a while, and I'm eating okay. It's like you may think you're staying the same, but you're probably actually going in the wrong direction. Is that right? I know neither one of us are necessarily health experts, but does that sound right?
Yeah, it is. I, again, in the same data set, I have access to things like measures of grip strength and also measures of cognition. And I see what happens to human bodies as they get older. The reality is that we decline. And it's one of the reasons that we retire is because we're not able to do the same things that we could before. I think a lot of people retire from especially a cognitively taxing job because we lose our ability to be as effective as we could have been in our late 40s and early 50s. It is just and I sometimes get pushback on this, that it's being ageist to say that we do lose our cognition as we get older. But the reality is that the data, you can't argue with 20,000 respondents in the HRS, and it is a line downward that it's about 1% per year. It's just reality. And I think we need to accept that that's part of the human condition. And when it comes to physical health, it is a battle. You're right. It gets worse as we get older. And if we're not fighting it, then the reality is that by the time we hit our 80s, we're going to look like our parents did when they were in their 70s or 80s, or their grandparents. If they weren't fighting it, that's our reality. But people who do fight it live differently and better. They can get more out of that decade of their life, but it does take a sacrifice. It is again a balance. It takes time and enjoyment and money today to make that investment so that you can live better in the future. I mean, it's kind of depressing that that's part of the game when we agree to be a human being, immortal. But if we recognize it, then we can manage it. We can make better choices.
Coming back to the idea of the sabbatical, as you were talking about it, it made me think to myself, it made me realize that it was it's not forced on you, but it's kind of forced on you, right? Like you get a sabbatical, it's sort of forced in there. Most jobs, most professions, most careers don't offer that. Right? And so I'd be curious to hear, number one, did you feel like, are you thankful that was sort of, I mean, you tell me the terminology you'd use, but basically like forced on you. And then number two, is the idea that we should try to get our clients to embrace the idea of these like mini retirement experiments?
I think it's a great idea, frankly. First of all, I do feel fortunate that as an academic, I had that opportunity. I know a lot of tech firms have experimented with the idea of having sabbaticals for their employees. I think it's great. I think that if you can get your employees to step away from their routine for a while, it's very likely that they're going to be more creative and more productive when they get back to work. It's something that we should all be considering for our employees. I think that there was an advisor that I was talking to once that encouraged her clients to, when they built up enough vacation, to just take that time and not travel, just stay at home and pretend that you're being retired. So imagine what especially if it's a couple, imagine what your life is going to be like if you have to spend all your time together in the home. And then how can you develop routines to keep yourself occupied and to enjoy that experience of being retirement? In other words, let's practice this retirement for a while. Let's step away from the routines and let's see what it looks like. Now, I think that used to be a lot more clever in the pre-COVID era, because I think what COVID did is it forced us to spend a year or so actually in that kind of environment where
That's right.
we all got a 1 year sabbatical. We could see what that was like. Now, the question becomes, did you have the discipline during that period to maintain your health? Did you have the discipline to maintain social contacts? If you didn't, that maybe is a little bit of insight into what your retirement lifestyle is going to look like. And if you needed more structure to get more out of your existence when you stepped away from the workplace and you were at home all the time, then maybe you need to think about developing a different type of lifestyle after you retire, so you have more structure, so that you don't fall into some of the bad habits that maybe some of us fell into during the COVID era.
It's amazing to me how COVID provided clarity for so many people. I haven't had a client back when it happened, and I tell this story a lot because it was so impactful on me, but a client named Rebecca, she's 59, had been working at the same job, same company for 20 years. It was in theater, right? And so theaters didn't fare so well during COVID since you had to be around mass amounts of people. Got let go. And before, when we first started working together, she was like, and I don't see myself retiring. I like my job. I enjoy what I do. I'll probably work as long as I can. And then if I eventually have to retire, I will. And we would have conversations where it's like, things could change. You may not always want. She's like, no. I love my job. I'm always going to work. So, okay, all right. COVID comes around. She gets let go. 6 months into it. So I guess it's like September of 2020. We're talking. And all of a sudden she's like, Brendan, I don't think I want to go back to work. I'm ready to retire. Like every week I get to spend time in my garden. I go to lunch with my friends. I get to be home and do the things I want to do. I get to go visit my sister whenever I want to and spend time with her. And the thing that always strikes me about that is if it were not for COVID forcing her into this basically retirement trial run, or call it whatever you want, call it time freedom trial run, whatever, but retirement trial run. She would have never had the clarity that she needed to figure out what it was that she actually wanted to do. She probably would have just continued to work because that's what she thought she wanted to do, right? But COVID made her stopped her in her tracks and forced her to be intentional and go, actually, this is what I want to spend my time doing. And it's just amazing to me. And it bothered me. I was like, why is it that we had to rely on COVID to have this kind of clarity? How else can we get people to the point where they realize what's truly most important to them? But to your point around, I think there's something to be said for encouraging these trial runs, these experiments, especially when it comes to really big decisions. Like Jake Northrup was on the podcast, episode 98. He talks about how he encourages his clients to do these spending experiments. So it may not be just an all-out, hey, I'm going to do like a 6-month retirement trial run. Maybe you say, hey, we really want to buy a beach house. You're like, all right, well, maybe before you buy the beach house, why don't you try renting one and living there for 2 to 4 weeks? Or we want to spend a year abroad. It's like, maybe try a month first. Or it's like, hey, we're going to buy an RV. And it's like, well, okay, maybe pause on buying the RV. It's a pretty big, expensive decision. What if you rented one for a month? Right? And so I'm fascinated by this idea of, how do we do more experiments and trial runs to create clarity?
Yeah, it's the problem is imagination, isn't it? That we are very bad at imagining how a different state of being is going to impact our happiness.
Yeah, very bad.
There's actually science on this that it's one of the things that we can do to improve our ability to imagine is to experience it. So that's why with the the famous RV story, that renting it can actually save you a lot of money because you are able to see what it's like to live in an RV, to go from one RV park to another, and the reality is that some people enjoy it. That it's a social experience for them. They get out of the RV, they put up their sign, they meet new people. Other people get to the RV park, they just watch TV, and then they move to the next spot, and it's not as enjoyable of an experience. But you don't know that. You have this idea of what it's going to be like, and it may or may not be accurate, because I think a lot of times people are not necessarily that self-aware about what is going to make them happier. It sounds like your client is very good at making herself happy, at finding things to do. That's
a good point.
Maybe not everybody has that skill. I don't know about you, but I tend to get restless, and if I'm not doing something productive, I'm maybe not as happy as I am when I'm around, doing things like giving presentations is one of the biggest sources of joy for me, because I'm forced to meet new people. I go out to dinner with them, I talk to them, I learn a little bit, I get in front of a stage, I get to perform, I get to use my mind. That is great. And for me, stopping that is going to have a negative impact on my life. It's not necessarily something that I want to do. And this whole idea about retirement is, what does it even mean? It just means that I'm doing something differently. I'm not doing my main occupation. And it may mean that I'm not making as much money, but it has a lot to do with how I'm spending my time. And if I'm getting a lot of joy out of my main occupation and I give that up, then I've got to replace that with some other activity. And if you're the kind of person who wasn't getting that much joy out of their job, but now has a lot of time for other things that make them much happier, that's probably someone who should retire. But someone like me, I just don't know. And again, what does retirement mean? Retirement means that we stop doing our primary occupation. But does that mean that we stop working? Does that mean that we no longer feel, what's wrong with doing something that you get paid for? If it's something that actually is providing you with joy. So I think part of this conversation is like getting to know yourself and what actually makes you happy. And that trial run is a good way to achieve self-discovery that we don't naturally get.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think you'll ever retire?
I don't think I'm ever going to fully retire. I think probably what I'll end up doing is, teaching is my job right now, and there's a certain amount of responsibilities that are associated with that. A lot of professors stay on way too long, and they teach longer than they should. I'm cognizant of that, and I think that, again, what does aging do to you that would make retirement more pleasurable? And as we know, aging has an impact on you physically, it has an impact on you cognitively. And if we recognize that, we can try to find activities that are more suitable for the older version of myself that are not going to seem as onerous. So if I'm in my 70s, I might enjoy writing. I might enjoy giving an occasional presentation. I might teach an occasional class. But I can't keep up the same level that I could now that I'm in my 50s. And I know that. Like in my 70s, I'm going to be a different person. So I've got to set myself up for that different future version of myself that is probably not going to enjoy the grind as much as I do right now.
So we talked about the first pillar at length, quite extensively, being health. So what's number two?
Well, number two is relationships. And in particular, your primary relationship is with your spouse. So the quality of that relationship is the strongest predictor of life satisfaction. If you have a positive relationship with your spouse, then it dominates everything else in terms of relationships. If you have a negative relationship with your spouse, then it has a big negative impact on your life satisfaction. And you and I were talking before the podcast about the interesting finding that women between the ages of 60 and 65 who get divorced are among the happiest retirees. And I think it's because if this is,
Yeah, I immediately deleted that podcast so my wife would never hear that nugget, by the way, just so you know.
but I think what happens is that people have these relationships that may have cracks in them. And then after retirement, they have to spend a lot of time with that other person. And especially men become more dependent on, it's maybe a little bit sexist to say this, but it shows up in the research that men don't do as good of a job of maintaining those non-spousal relationships. And it means that they become more dependent on their spouse in retirement. And the wife in an opposite sex couple may just say, well, you know, I don't want to spend all my time with this person. Maybe the quality of the relationship is not giving me the happiness that I expected it to. I'm going to be happier on my own. And that's very possible. You know, but it is absolutely consistent with the relationship dynamics that we observe in retirement. And that is that oftentimes women do a better job of making those investments in friendships. And that's the number 2 source of happiness in terms of relationships, is the quality of the relationship that you have with your friends. Now, your friends, again, are people that you choose to be with. And, you know, I think there could be a whole episode on cultivating friendship relationships, figuring out which ones are healthiest, investing in those, not investing in other friendships that are not providing the same amount of satisfaction.
Yeah.
But your kids has that relationship that you have with your kids has no impact on life satisfaction.
Really?
In retirement. So I have never been able to run an analysis where the quality of the relationship that you have with your children has a positive impact on life satisfaction in retirement. So
wow. I don't think most people, I think that would come as a shock to a lot of people, right?
I think it does. And I think especially for couples where there's one spouse who is thinking, hey, we're going to move closer to the kids after retirement, we're going to spend more time with them. I don't have any data that backs that up to show that being closer to your kids, spending more time with your kids is a wise choice to make as part of your retirement plan. But it makes sense, I think, when you think about it, because kids don't have a huge amount of time to spend with their parents. They have their own lives, and you know, there's always it's 2 parents, right? There's and the relationship quality they may have with the kids may not be the same. You know, there's always going to be a mother or a father-in-law. You know, there's always going to be those dynamics. There's frankly time. Like, what is the expectation of how many weekends per month that you're going to spend with your parents? If it's more than one, it may be too much. You know, and then it creates frictions, and it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to navigate a dynamic where the input that you get from your children is going to be as strong as the input that you get from your friends or from your spouse as a source of life satisfaction. So don't necessarily expect that your kids are going to be a big input towards your happiness in retirement.
So next time you're meeting with a client who says that they're moving to be closer to their kids, say, no, hang on. Not the best idea you've ever had. You need to stay put. Actually hang out with your kids less. Now, okay, obviously that you're not going to do that, but you said there's no evidence to support that being with your kids improves happiness and satisfaction. Is there evidence to the other side where it's like it actually is detrimental?
Yeah, I did a study. So I did a couple of studies on this. One, the multivariate study. The other one was more descriptive. And if you live within 10 miles of your kid, you are significantly less happy. So that...
I'm deleting this podcast as well so that my in-laws do not hear it, because that's fascinating, though. Again, I just think most people would say like the exact opposite. You know, family's important to us. It's number one. We want to be close. We want to be nearby, right?
Right. You know, and I think one of the things that can happen is that we can project the joy that we get from being around our family at Christmas or holidays or, you know, onto an expectation that we're going to get that same amount of joy when we see them more frequently. So one of the questions you could ask is, well, explain to me, how often do you expect to see your kids? Like, how many times per month are you going to be visiting them? And, you know, what is that relationship going to look like? Are you going to be essentially a underpaid babysitter for your kids? Are you, you know, how does your spouse think about that? You know, maybe have a conversation between the two of them and at least get them to imagine what that could look like. And then that makes it easier for them, even draw it out. Like, are there some negative dynamics in that relationship? And, because I think everybody thinks like their kids are awesome and the relationship they have with their kids is great, but forcing them to acknowledge reality can be a helpful way of imagining what it could be like.
The other thing that I think, this is literally just right off the top of my head, maybe you have research that supports it or takes away from it, but I could also see the scenario being that you have parents and grandparents that when you think about their social network, their human connection, they're relying on their kids and their family for the majority of it. In other words, it's like that's where I'm getting that's who I'm spending my time with. So that maybe they think subconsciously I don't need as much time and connection elsewhere, or they're spending so much time with their family that they're not creating the time. It's almost like they feel like they're getting it fulfilled because they're getting connection with their family and grandkids. And that leaves less reason maybe to go out and find social circles and find friends and communities and people to hang out with and be a part of. What do you think? Feel free to refute that entirely, by the way.
That's a challenge when you're a parent, is that, you have this life stage where kids are so dependent on you, and it can be very easy not to maintain those kind of relationships with others, with old friends, with
right,
even your spouse. It's
yeah, totally
being very deliberate about that, recognizing that at one point the kids are going to move on, they're going to have their own lives, they're going to be independent. I think that's an important part of investing in yourself for the future. Is, we make a lot of sacrifices to be with our kids, to make our kids happy. We feel like we have very close relationships with them, but the reality is that once they're out of the house and they're gone, then those interactions become less frequent. And your kids build their own set of relationships that they then rely on as their primary source of social interaction. And you have to be aware that that's going to be the dynamics that are going to occur in the future. And especially in retirement, kids are not going to be it.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Now, does this impact of human connection and so the social benefit, or being social, we'll just call it human connection. Does the impact of human connection, is it just as substantial, just as powerful and helpful at all ages? Or is it like, hey, you need more of this now, like at a certain age than you do when you get older? Is it just as potent, maybe, regardless of your age?
Yeah, I haven't studied that. That's a great question. And, I just lump everybody together in retirement, and I look at social interactions as a predictor of life satisfaction.
Sure.
But I don't know in particular if it's stronger in your 60s or your 80s. I haven't looked at that. It's actually an interesting question.
Note to self, email Michael after show to conduct research. Okay, got it. All right, so that's number one and number two. That leaves one more pillar.
Money.
That whole money thing.
It's good news that for those of us who are in this profession, money does actually make you happier. One of the things that we've noticed is a couple of things that we've noticed, that life satisfaction does go up with wealth. So people who have more wealth are generally happier, but there tends to be this inflection at about $4 million or so. And after that point, it plateaus and actually dips a little bit. So if you're thinking about how much money do you need to save to have the most amount of happiness in retirement, it seems like there's this like $4 to $5 million threshold where, it's basically, do you have enough to do whatever you want to do, to never have to worry about money? And
so that's how you would explain that. If somebody was to say, what's the magic at 4 million? Why is that the magic number? It's maybe you could say that at that point you have enough to do, maybe not whatever you want to do, but most of the things that you would ever want to do.
Yeah, I think at that point, psychologically, it's not a barrier. You can do whatever you want to do. But beyond that, it becomes a little bit of a burden, right? Because you have to manage it. You have to figure out what to do with all this excess cash. There's estate planning, there's managing, it's investments and taxes and all this stuff that happens when you become super wealthy, that if you have something that is more manageable, then it seems to make people happier. So, I mean, I'm not going to say no to getting at those upper echelons, but I think it's useful to recognize that there is this sort of plateau when it comes to life satisfaction. It's about $4 to $5 million. The other is, what is the form of wealth? So, this is the paper that David Blanchett and I just looked at recently. There's really two forms of wealth. And we have a conversation about when you're creating a balance sheet, do you incorporate, for example, the present value of Social Security as part of your balance sheet? Do you put in the present value of pensions? It's been our philosophy for a long time that those are resources that you draw from in retirement, therefore you have to put them on the retirement balance sheet. So the present value of Social Security, the present value of a pension. And then you can do things like, if I have a pension that's worth $500,000 in present value terms, so what would that look like? That would look like about $30,000 to $35,000 a year. So if I went in the market,
obviously you've done this before a time or two to just rattle it off like that. But yes, okay.
The thing I do in my spare time is I look up how much income can you buy for a certain amount of wealth.
Yeah.
But let's say that I had $500,000 of cash, and I could just go right now and I could buy myself $35,000 a year of income. Mm-hmm. Would I be happier if I had $500,000 of cash, or would I be happier with $35,000 of income? Would I spend more? And first of all, there's theory that would say that you're happier with the income, especially if it's in the form of, say, a pension, because I know the money's not going to run out in old age, so I can just spend the $35,000 and not worry about it. Whereas if I had $50,000 a year, then maybe I can spend $25,000 a year to the age of 100. And then at the age of 100, I would run out. So naturally, I'm going to spend less from wealth that is not annuitized, because I have to worry about the possibility that I might run out. So I'm going to be a little bit more cautious. So you would expect people to spend more from annuitized income, like a pension or Social Security. However, the data says that they spend even more than you would have expected. So they spend more from lifetime income from a pension than they would from having an extra $500,000. It's even more than what the economic theory would predict is rational. So it does seem that when it comes to a flow, people feel comfortable spending that money. When it comes to a stock, money what do I mean by stock is just money that's sitting there in an account. You don't feel as comfortable spending that down over time. And that's a big psychological problem in the defined contribution era, because what we see when we look at the data, and I can follow these retirees over time. There's this one poor woman in the health and retirement study who's got about $1.5 million of financial assets, and she gets about $25,000 from Social Security, and she spends $25,000 a year. She has meaning
she only spends Social Security.
She spends her Social Security. She doesn't spend the rest.
Yeah.
Now, why is that? I don't know. She doesn't feel comfortable spending it. She doesn't feel like, she's allowed to spend it. If the money got smaller, would it make her upset? Maybe
nervous.
All sorts of emotional issues that are tied to that balance. But for whatever reason, we don't seem as willing to spend out of savings as we do from income. And what that means is, like, if we're building a game plan for retirement and we have this pot of money where the goal of the money is income, what's the right way to allocate it? Is it to take a portion of it, especially the bond portion of an asset allocation, and buy a lifetime income with it, because you know that your client is going to spend more. They're going to live better. Now, there's a lot of debate over the concept of annuities, but I am an economist, so I see annuities as more of a theoretical idea. And annuities mean it's wealth that is transformed into a lifetime income. And
if you just simply looked at it as guaranteed income or a pension, then it would be perceived differently than even when you introduce the term annuity, right? That in and of itself comes with a little bit of a bias. In fact, I'm glad you brought this up because that's one of the things that I wrote down to talk about was this research that I think you did with David Blanchett around how guaranteed income creates a license to spend. And then it just so happens that Social Security provides a guaranteed income, pensions provide a guaranteed income. Guess what? Not many people have pensions anymore. And then another option to provide guaranteed income is an annuity or an annuitized income stream. And so one of the first things I thought about when I saw this makes so much sense logically, empirically, based on the data. It also makes sense that, hey, if you know that this is going to be coming in no matter what, as long as you live, you're more likely and willing to spend it. And then at the same time, I'm thinking, I wonder how much blowback he gets from the industry when he even mentions the possibility of an annuity and it being a good tool to use. That was one thing I'm like, do you get the anti-annuity crowd coming and basically ready to take you down and throw things at you on the stage when you even mention that?
Yeah, so I wrote an article last year where I criticized Ken Fisher's stance towards the use of annuities.
I hate annuities and you should too.
And what I criticized was him essentially saying he would never use one. He would never recommend one to a client.
Yeah.
When, if you read the economic literature, annuitization is the most efficient way to generate income in retirement. And then, maybe you relax a few assumptions so that you don't annuitize 100% of your savings. But there's no model that exists where partial annuitization doesn't make sense for anybody. So you're holding yourself out as a fiduciary, you're making recommendations in the best interest of a client, you're also simultaneously saying that you would never use a financial product that has broad support among financial economists, then are you really a fiduciary if you're not even willing to consider it? There's so much baggage that's associated with the A word. And, it's a lot of it is, as an economist, I'm not, I've become aware of the baggage. And I think there's a lot of very legitimate reasons why the baggage exists. But in this world of fiduciary retirement income advisors, we have to be open-minded to the idea that we cannot protect against idiosyncratic longevity risk or not knowing how long you're going to live using conventional assets. The only product that can do that is an annuity, and it is, because it's an idiosyncratic risk of not knowing how long you're going to live, there's no benefit to taking it. So transferring that risk to an institution is going to allow you to spend more money. And as it turns out, there is also this behavioral benefit that you feel more comfortable spending the money at the same time. So I think we can have a legitimate conversation about how annuities are sold, whether the product designs are truly in the best interests of retirees, how we would have done things differently, how compensation impacts recommendations. But the reality is that more people should be taking a portion of their wealth and transferring that longevity risk to an institution somehow. And annuities are the way that you do it in the marketplace. But there's, and of course, after I wrote that Ken Fisher article, I actually got a email from a former Ken Fisher employee who lambasted me for, promoting annuities and used a lot of language that was very emotional. Yeah. And I wrote him a very unemotional response, which is like, this is reality, and we've got to be open to the reality that these, a certain product structure can provide value, and then you can evaluate it objectively. But when you bring emotion to that conversation, then are you really making recommendations that are in the best interest of the client? Because you're allowing your emotion to supersede the potential for benefit.
Yeah, your own body, right? No, yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Granted, Ken Fisher just uses that as a great, well-executed marketing scheme that gets people in the door, right? So, I mean, anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, call whatever you want, but guaranteed income, basically this money coming in no matter what for the rest of your life. It helps you sleep better at night, feel more comfortable, and it encourages you, gets you to spend more so you can do more with your money and get more out of life. I think I saw in the study there's a stat that retirees will spend about twice as much per year in retirement if they hold guaranteed income wealth rather than investment wealth. Twice as much per year. I mean, just imagine the things that you could double if you had twice as much, the things that you could do, the things you could spend on, the way you can increase your life, enhance your life. I mean, that's no small thing.
No, and it actually has pretty major economic implications that, retirees could be contributing more to GNP if, for example, in target date defaults, we were putting maybe 30 or 40% of their savings into some form of guaranteed income. We know that retirees would spend more. In fact, I just did testimony last week in DC on this topic, which is like we really haven't figured out, especially in the defined contribution system, we've done a great job of protecting participants to accumulate money in target date funds. Like they can just leave it alone and do a great job, but we've done nothing to help them actually spend it down. And so, let's use the science to determine what the best way is for spending it down, because there are all sorts of policy and social implications of doing it wrong, and we're seeing that reality. The reality is that people are just not spending it the way they should.
Is there any formula or calculation or research that would support or inform what amount of your income should be guaranteed? Is it as extreme as, hey, if 100% of your income is guaranteed, you're better off that way? Is it like, hey, at least make sure 50% of your income's guaranteed? Is there any formula there? Any research on that?
Yeah, so there is a mathematical proof that was done in the 1960s, and that is that you have wealth, and the wealth could be in the form of stocks and bonds, and then you have the same amount of wealth wrapped in an annuity. And if you wrap it in an annuity, you can spend significantly more. So the optimal allocation is 100%. Now that assumes that you don't have these blocky expenses in retirement. So for example, a healthcare expense that might be really high or things like that.
Right.
And that's, having a certain amount of liquidity to meet those expenses makes a lot of sense. We also have a lot of annuitized wealth already in the form of Social Security. So that's going to reduce the amount of optimal annuitized wealth. But just all else equal, we would hold assets within an annuity wrapper because it gets rid of that longevity risk, and there's no compensation for accepting that longevity risk. We do not spend more because we accept the longevity risk. There is a misperception, I think, among financial advisors that you miss out on the upside by wrapping an asset within an annuity wrapper. Well, you can wrap a 60-40 portfolio in an annuity wrapper. That is the original design of the variable annuity back in the early 1950s by a guy named William Greenaw, who ended up creating this annuity at TIAA CREF. So that annuity, that CREF annuity, is essentially that idea of a balanced portfolio within an annuity wrapper that takes away the longevity risk, and your income goes up or down every year depending on the performance of investments, but you get all of that upside potential. So, annuitized assets are going to allow you to spend more money. Now, how much is optimal? I don't know. I mean, if you asked participants, we did a survey a couple of years ago, Jason Fichtner and I at the BPC, and we found that ideally most people would put about 40%, 30 to 40% of their savings into a guaranteed income. That seems to be a sweet spot because people like to be able to maintain a certain amount of investment assets. Now, there's also a question, especially if you buy a lifetime income where the income is stable over time with that money, then with the remainder of your savings, you should be able to take a greater amount of investment risk because you've already built that base of income essentially with bond-like assets.
Right. Yeah. To your point as well around missing out on the upside. It's like, yes, that's true. I get that concept. Yes, there's variable annuities, but if it's not a variable annuity, you're in some other sort of annuity product where you're annuitizing, you don't have the upside. But it comes back to what we said earlier, which is, so you have more upside, which means you can grow your wealth. But if you're not at the same time spending as much as you could or using the growth to spend it on the things that lead to a more happy, fulfilling life, then what's the point? Right? Like, what would you rather have more wealth and not be able to spend it, or would you rather have the license to spend and feel good about it and be not forced, but essentially like you have more money to spend, you're going to spend more. So in other words, you miss out on the upside, but unless you were going to use that upside to spend more anyways, it doesn't really, that math doesn't really work.
Yeah, Brendan, we had a panel at AICPA in June. It was Michael Kitzes and David Blanchett and myself. And there was a whole conversation about adjusting spending. So if the market does poorly, you use a guardrail approach, you adjust your spending downward. You can start out maybe a little bit higher, but nobody in the room was thinking about adjusting upward. And to me, if you're not also adjusting upward, if the market does well, if you're not allowing yourself to spend more to actually capture that upside, then the only people who benefit from that are your heirs and your financial advisor. And that is not traditionally a part of the conversation when it comes to retirement income planning. We're all focused on the worst possible scenario that could happen, but some people are going to get lucky and they're going to be able to spend more. We have to be able to find ways to give them the comfort to be able to adjust their spending up beyond what we had traditionally or what we had originally planned for when we created the retirement income plan. So, let's have a realistic conversation about adjustment both up and down and allow people, if that's their goal, if the goal is to spend the money, and there's a whole conversation that we can have about this. I mean, we're already going way over time, but that I feel like it's the advisor's job to, first of all, figure out how much they want to pass on to others, how much they want to spend, and then help them feel comfortable spending that chunk of money where the goal is lifestyle. And it's okay if that money gets smaller because that's what the goal is.
Yeah. There's sort of a mental accounting element there, right? Where you're like, I've sort of bucketed it off. Like this is for needs, this is for legacy, but now I've got this lifestyle bucket. And if I can see it as that, then it's almost like if it's not going down, that means the feedback is I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing with it. It's almost a way to, if you see it as this is my lifestyle money, it's okay seeing it go down because you've got all your other things taken care of, right? I mean, I don't know if that's
right. Yeah. I mean, that's the way we should be thinking, but that's not the way that most people think. Not the way most people want to preserve their nest egg, but that's if you preserve your nest egg, it's going to get spent by someone else.
Yeah, it goes back to what you said at the beginning, which it's funny. I say this all the time too. You either get to you have two goals. Your money gets used in one of two ways. You either get to use it to live or to give. Either you use it or somebody else is going to use it. And then inevitably when I'm talking with clients or in front of groups, you'll always have the person that says, yeah, or it'll go to the government. You pay taxes. And it's like, okay, well, that's still giving it to somebody else, right? But either you use it to live or you use it to give. As we come to the end here, Michael, before the rapid fire 3-pack, is there anything else you want to say or you think we should know?
Oh, well, let's just, I want to complete that last conversation, live or give, but we can give with a warm hand or we can give with a cold hand. So, the giving does not just mean giving the money at death. Giving people the license to be able to give that money away during the lifetime actually might make them happier than through an estate. So we can't use that dichotomy of either, be selfish or pass it on. We actually have to recognize that we can be unselfish during our retirement and get more enjoyment out of that giving.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, rapid fire 3-pack of questions, if you're ready.
I am ready. I don't know if I have a great answer for all the questions, but let's have it.
Yeah, I bet your answers are adequate enough. All right, you get to sit back, observe, watch, listen to a roundtable discussion. Any three people talking about money and how it relates to behavior, psychology, satisfaction, happiness. Who would it be?
I obviously am a big fan of Danny Kahneman. His books are great, always worth reading. Richard Thaler, I've been involved in a few panels with Richard Thaler. Also, one of my favorite people. He's incredibly wise, but especially his interplay with Danny is really fun. And, the third person, I think, I'm working with a guy named David Stewart right now on some research, and he's more of an expert in the philosophy of living well in retirement. So he's a big health guru and he's big on relationships and things like that.
Okay.
And he's really opened my eyes to aspects of behavioral retirement planning that I had never considered before. So just as a very quick point, in a recent survey that we did together, he asked me to include a question about how positive do you feel about the future? And I thought this was a throwaway question. It's not going to have any impact on things like retirement saving behavior. It dominated everything else. So in other words, you were twice as likely to save 10% of your income for retirement if you had a positive attitude about the future.
Well, you sort of alluded to that earlier in one of our conversations, that it's not just how focused you are on the future, but how you feel about
That's right.
the future.
If when I'm thinking about what motivates me to save for the future, if I have a positive attitude about it, then I'm much more likely to save the money. It's almost like, how do I believe that the money is going to, am I capable of being happy when I'm in my 70s? If I feel that, if I have a positive attitude, then I'm far more motivated. And it opens up a whole side of behavioral finance that moves beyond that sort of Danny Kahneman perspective on biases and is more about helping understand things that are not normally captured by economic variables.
Man, you buried this great nugget for the last part of the conversation. I've got so many questions. Now that'll be maybe another episode, but let me ask you this: to go down a David Stewart path, or to open the floodgates to his work, like, does he have research that's out there? Has he written a book? Like, where can you find?
You can find his stuff on
I'm asking selfishly, basically.
Ageist.com.
Ageist?
Ageist.com.
Ageist.com. All right. Awesome. All right. You get to gift one book to everybody that's listening. What would it be?
I'm a big fan of the literature, the new emerging literature on what motivates human beings based on how we've evolved. So there's this social evolution literature that I am in love with. There's so many great books right now. I'm not going to recommend that book, but I'm telling you, you got to get out there in the literature and read how human beings have evolved as social animals. I mean, what makes us successful? There's a great book called The Secret of Our Success that is written about how human beings, we're not very strong. We don't have hair on our bodies. We're not very capable of living through severe climates. But the one thing we've got going for us is that we have these large social groups that interact together collaboratively. And so our brains are essentially wired, and we've developed all of these habits over time that are related to our ability to function as effectively as groups. Now, it's positive and it's negative, because we also have this tendency to want to exclude some people that are not part of our group, the out-group stuff. And of course, we've gotten so much better at exploiting that to get people angry to each other all the time.
Or there's tribal behavior, right? Where you're like, I'm going to do this because that's what the people in my tribe do. Who cares if it makes any logical sense?
Yeah, if you haven't read Tribe by Sebastian Junger, that's a great book too. But the book I'm going to recommend for financial advisors is called Habits of a Happy Brain. And it sounds like a very light title, but it's written by a woman named Loretta Graziano Bruning. And it is the best book I've ever read at helping you understand the 4 primary brain chemicals. And there's a lot of evolutionary psychology in there too, about how it is that we've evolved to use these brain chemicals to reward us or to make us feel fear. But I think if you understand the way the chemicals operate, then you can gain insight into what motivates human beings much better than even some of these academic kind of books. Now, she is an academic also, but she explains these concepts in a very simple way. It is one of the most valuable books I've read at understanding human motivations.
All right. Habits of a Happy Brain. Never been mentioned before. That sounds fascinating. I'm all in. I'll be visiting Amazon here in a moment. All right. Who is the best listener in your life, and what does he or she do so well that makes him such a great listener?
Oh, the friend that I've mentioned previously who lives in
Steve?
Chicago. Yes. He knows me. We've known each other since we were in college. He's a very smart guy, but he's also very good at using some of these techniques that you have talked about in the past about letting people talk, absorbing the information, processing it, having a useful conversation, throwing it back at me in a way, he knows me. So he knows when I'm saying something, I may not have fully processed it. He helps me process that information. That's what you want from a friend is somebody that can help you take your vision of reality and turn it into something that's actually more helpful and accurate. So that's my definition of a good listener.
All right. So make sure you're spending your money to hang out with Steve more often, by the way.
That's right. I do that.
All right. The one you've been dreading all along, the last one, the bonus question. You could hang a poster. Put up a poster in the wall of every advisor around the world. What would it say? Money isn't everything. You want to elaborate? Even though you can't elaborate on the poster, do you want to?
Because I think that when people come to see a financial advisor, they think they're coming to see a financial advisor to make more money or invest better or pay lower taxes. And money is just an input. And your job as a financial advisor is to try to find a way to help the client use their money to meet their life goals. Now, maybe that means you need to have a deeper conversation and there needs to be self-discovery on the part of the client to actually recognize what those goals are. But
well, definitely. Yeah, right.
It's not just about the money. Maybe that's the poster. It's not just about the money.
Money isn't everything, or it's not just about the money. Either one. We'll have both of them made. We'll send them to you. You can see which one you like better, and then we'll start distributing. All right, Michael. It's been great. It's been fun. Enjoy it and appreciate it. For anybody that's listening that wants to know more about you or learn more or join your fan club, where can they go? What should they do?
Oh, gosh. So I have a website, michaelfinke.com. I also have a new software program called Income Path that leads you through these steps in a retirement planning process and provides visualization to make those choices easier. So follow Income Path on LinkedIn. Most of the stuff that I post on LinkedIn, so that's the easiest way to follow me.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to beginning our research study together on the impact of social connections at various ages to see if it varies.
It is a fascinating topic. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Michael.
Hey, everybody. Brendan again. First of all, thank you for listening. Second of all, if you listen and you're thinking to yourself, I like this, but I want to dive deeper, I want more ideas and insights on how to apply this day in and day out, there's two things you can do. First and foremost, you can subscribe to my monthly newsletter that I write called The Wired Advisor. Every month, there'll be one article and then 5 resources that I've found from around the internet and the industry, articles, podcasts, videos, social links, on the best ideas and insights to apply the human side in your practice, your process, and your conversations. If you want to sign up for that, go to www.rfgadvisory.com/newsletter-subscription. That's www.rfgadvisory.com/newsletter-subscription. That's where you're going to get the best ideas and insights. But the other option is to go find me on LinkedIn. So go to LinkedIn, search Brendan Fraser, and I post pretty much every day on ideas, tips, and insights for you to be able to master the human side of money.
Content here is for illustrative purposes and general information only. It is not legal, tax, or individualized financial advice, nor is it a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any specific security or engage in any specific trading strategy. Information here may be provided in part by third-party sources. These sources are generally deemed to be reliable. However, neither our guest nor RFG Advisory guarantee the accuracy of third-party sources. The views expressed here are those of our guest. They do not necessarily represent those of RFG Advisory, its employees, or its clients. This commentary should not be regarded as a description of advisory services provided by RFG Advisory or performance returns of any client. The views reflected in the commentary are subject to change at any time without notice. Securities offered by registered representatives of Private Client Services, member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services offered by investment advisory representatives of RFG Advisory, LLC, RFG Advisory or RFG, a registered investment advisor. Private Client Services and RFG Advisory are unaffiliated entities. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where RFG Advisory and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. No advisory services may be rendered by RFG Advisory unless a client agreement is in place. RFG Advisory is an SEC-registered investment advisor. SEC registration does not constitute an endorsement of RFG by the Commission, nor does it indicate that RFG or any associated investment advisory representative has attained a particular level of skill or ability.